Again, my name is Francisco Gonzalez with National Review Institute. I work on the philanthropy development side of the organization. We are the nonprofit journalistic think tank that supports the mission of National Review, the major talent at National Review, and also we do a lot of programming to help further the Buckley legacy, the legacy of our founder, William F. Buckley Jr., and the founder of National Review magazine when he founded it back in 1955. And so I do also want to welcome a lot of our 1955 Society members, our supporters, and also those who support and follow the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, who we are really extremely excited to partner with today. We are all now socially distanced for the time being, but I think all of us are trying to make best use of our time and resources to still provide great content to you and also for us to hear from you. And so as we continue going forward in this conversation today, I want to remind everybody to use the chat box or the Q&A box so that you can ask questions. And then in the Q&A session of this, Kyle, we'll get some questions to Kyle and Ramesh that you are asking in the Q&A and chat boxes. So please continue to do that throughout the call. Also, I wanted to let you know that National Review Institute, for those of you who follow us or may not, we actually started a virtual book club. So this coming Monday, this is going to be our second book coming up. We're going to be reviewing the book Up From Liberalism by William F. Buckley Jr. Throughout 3 sessions that are going to be led by one of our National Review Institute fellows, Jay Nordlinger. So you can go to our website, nrinstitute.org, to sign up for that. There's no cost to sign up for the book club, although it is being offered to our supporters. So thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to thank my colleague, Miranda Melvin, for helping put this together, and also to one of the vice presidents of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, Benita Dodd, who you don't see on the screen just yet, but you do see Kyle and Ramesh. And let me before I hand it over to Kyle, I'm just going to introduce Ramesh here. As you know, Ramesh Ponnuru has been with National Review for over 20 years. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, which syndicates nationally across the country through different newspapers and outlets. He's also a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he's based in Washington, D.C., and a contributing editor to National Affairs. He's really everywhere. You see him, a lot of times you see him on CBS on Sunday mornings. And so I encourage you to check him out and check his comments out there. In 2015, he was included in the Politico 50 of Politico's list of the thinkers, doers, and dreamers who really matter in American politics. He also had a book in 2014 that he edited called Room to Grow: Conservative Reforms for a Limited Government and a Thriving Middle Class. He's, like I said, been a columnist as well as an editor now at National Review and a fellow with National Review Institute. He actually has a brand new article that just went up in the last hour at nationalreview.com that will also be in the upcoming magazine that you may have already received, called What Will and Won't COVID-19 Change About Our Politics? So I encourage you to check that out as well at nationalreview.com. Now I'm just going to hand this over to Kyle. Kyle, thank you so much for partnering with us. We wish we could be there in person with you like we were last year with David French, but we will be back in Atlanta soon, and we're just glad that we're able to do this virtually. We have the blessing of technology to do that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Francisco, and it is great to partner with NRI for the second straight year. We look forward to continuing this working relationship for years to come, and to having people get together in person in Atlanta the next time we're able to do this. But we are certainly grateful for everyone's flexibility and for the technology that lets us do this. For those of you who maybe came to us or to this event through the NRI side rather than the Georgia Public Policy Foundation side, I'll just say a brief bit about what it is that we do. We are an independent resource for voters and elected officials here in Georgia, and we provide actionable solutions to real life problems by bringing people together. And so it's with partners like NRI that we work, and we try to tackle the bread and butter issues that Georgians face in their economic lives, things like education, healthcare, transportation, taxes, and so on. So we are very glad to hear the message today about maybe where the country is with regard to socialism. We certainly are a group that espouses limited government and free markets, and so we are interested in hearing what Ramesh has to say. And so Ramesh, I'll hand the floor over to you, and then after some initial remarks by him, we'll have kind of a moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions. If you would put those in the Q&A box or the chat box. So Ramesh, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Francisco, for that introduction as well. I appreciate everything you do to support. I think you just described it as the major talent at National Review. I'm glad that you also support some of the minor talent as well. And I am sorry that I can't be in Atlanta. I was actually looking forward to going down there and seeing some old friends I haven't seen for a while. The topic that we are discussing today is, of course, a pretty serious one, but it does bring to mind something I heard, gosh, back maybe 25 years ago when I was starting at National Review. A little bit of lore from the early days of the magazine. I was told of a guy who was sort of put up as a sacrificial lamb to run for city council in New York back in the 1960s from the magazine. This guy, Dan Oliver, who went on to a distinguished career, became federal trade commissioner during the Reagan administration. He was doing a candidate forum, and he was being heckled by a lady in the back of the room who used the F word, called him a fascist. And so Dan, who's sort of the soul of politeness, said, "Well, come on now, we can disagree, but surely we can dispense with that kind of insult. For you to call me a fascist would be like my calling you a communist." And at that, the lady stood up indignantly and said, "But I am a communist." And it's an exchange that has struck me a lot lately, because it seems as though for many years, conservatives and Republicans would describe progressives as being socialists or socialistic, and they would indignantly deny it. But in recent years, it seems as though more and more of them are willing to say, yes, we are. We're out and proud socialists. And of course, the prominence of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Bernie Sanders campaign have both been really key parts of that trend. The thing that strikes me as I think about this resurgence of socialism is that there is both less and more to it than meets the eye. I want to talk a little bit about both of those things. There's less to it than meets the eye, which is the good news, but there is something, and that's the bad news, that those of us who believe in free markets and limited government and decentralization are going to need to grapple with. Starting with the why there's less to it than there seems to be. One important part of it is that a lot of the people who are now embracing the label socialism don't seem to have much of an idea of what it is they mean by it. And in fact, the surveys are really quite clear about this. If you ask people the follow-up question after they said that they're socialists, what does that mean? Do you mean that the government should own the means of production? Do you just mean a larger welfare state? Don't know, aren't sure. That's the plurality answer that you get. And only about, I think, 17% of people are willing to embrace the traditional definition of government ownership of industry. And when you listen to the socialist would-be leaders like Sanders, you don't necessarily get a more concrete sense of this. Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, although he has certainly over the years given aid and comfort to a lot of non-democratic socialist regimes. But in his big set piece speeches on what socialism means over the last 5 years, he has basically been advancing two propositions. The first being that socialism was a smear that FDR's opponents used to describe the New Deal. And the second being that all that he means when he says he's a socialist is he wants to continue FDR's legacy, which seems to suggest that actually it wasn't a smear in the first place. So not a lot of concreteness there. If you actually look at the survey research on whether people call themselves socialists, you will see that there's been a real narrowing of the gap. It used to be that in the United States, a lot more people were willing to describe themselves as supporters of free market capitalism than of socialism, and that has now narrowed a lot. And among young people, there are more people who are embracing socialism than embracing capitalism. So in 2010, when Gallup asked this question among 18 to 29-year-olds, the 18 to 29-year-olds of 2010 were saying that they were capitalists rather than socialists by a healthy 23-point margin. But by 2018, that had shifted to -6. The socialists now outnumbered the capitalists by 6 points. But if you drill down into that a little deeper, what you find is this is, excuse me, almost entirely a result of a decline in the percentage of Americans who call themselves capitalists, and almost none of it is the increase in people embracing socialism. So if you look again at Gallup, you've seen between 2010 and 2018, 2010, 36% of Americans said they were socialists by self-description, 36%. 8 years later, which is the last time I've got numbers, 8 years later, that number has increased all the way from 36% to 37%. So it's essentially a flat number. Even among young people, it's a flat number. 2010, 45% say that socialism is something they have a favorable opinion of. 2018, it's still 45%. It's been flat. The difference is the support for capitalism has plummeted. Among people overall, it dropped. Actually, I shouldn't say plummet for people overall. It's dropped like 5 points. It went from 61% to 56%. But among young people, it went from 68% support in 2010 to 45% support in 2018. So a real decline in those numbers. That's what is driving the change. That's what's driving this relative resurgence of socialism over capitalism. Now, and I think this is something that's been really misunderstood for a lot of reasons. One really big one, I think, was the Sanders campaign. Sanders got 45% of the Democratic primary vote in 2016, and that made a lot of people sit up and think, wow, socialism is really making a comeback. And that's certainly something that Sanders and his hardcore socialist supporters were eager to believe themselves and eager to broadcast. But I think in retrospect, particularly if you look at how Sanders did in 2020, it becomes ever clearer that what happened in 2016 was not so much that people were flocking to Sanders in the Democratic primaries because he was a socialist, as that they were flocking to him because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. And for young people in particular in the Democratic Party, she was not a natural repository of their kind of idealistic inclinations. And in the end, Sanders was better for the cause of socialism than the cause of socialism was for Sanders. And when you got to a primary situation where Clinton wasn't in contention and where Sanders wasn't the only real alternative to Clinton, his numbers dropped. Even in the states he was winning, he was doing substantially worse than he had done in 2016. But in the meantime, this storyline about socialism had sort of taken on a life of its own. You look at the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez story and her like-minded comrades, if you will, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Again, I think you see a misunderstanding, because what you had in those cases was heavily Democratic districts, which were won by these left-wing candidates in primaries. In the case of Ocasio-Cortez, basically because the incumbent was sort of caught napping, and you had a low turnout election without which she almost certainly wouldn't have won. But this was a misunderstanding. And in fact, if you look at the pattern of 2018 wins for the Democratic Party, they pick up 41 seats in the House. Most of those seats were overwhelmingly, of course, suburban seats. They were won by Democrats who were not aligning themselves with Ocasio-Cortez, but were presenting themselves as middle of the road people who were designed to appeal to the kind of voters who had picked Mitt Romney in 2012 and then switched to Hillary Clinton in 2016. And in fact, if you look at Medicare for All's co-sponsors in the House, the number of co-sponsors actually dropped between 2017, when you had a Republican House, and 2019, when you had a Democratic House, which is really something when you think of this 41-seat pickup on the part of the Democrats. That means that the percentage of Democrats who have endorsed Medicare for All in the House really, really dropped. So all of this is by way of saying that there's less than meets the eye to this resurgence of socialism. But I don't think it's something that we can totally dismiss. I think we take very seriously the drop in support, particularly among young people, for free market capitalism. And there, I think, you can look at a number of reasons why this might have happened, but I think that the most persuasive explanation for it is that we went through a lot of pretty bad years. I mean, if you think about it, 2001 to 2003, you've got a mild recession, but a lingering one. Then in 2008, the bottom drops out of the economy. You have a very severe recession, the worst we've had since the Great Depression. And then you have a very slow and halting recovery from that. And what this ends up meaning overall is that between 2001 and 2014, people in the middle of the income distribution don't see an increase in their wages. They don't see an increase in their compensation. That's really the first time we've seen that. I mean, if you look at the data we've got on this question, we've got pretty good data on it from 1955 onwards, and you don't have a similar period of stagnation that lasts that long. When you have a period of stagnation that lasts that long, it shakes people's faith because our system was delivering material progress for most people year to year, decade to decade, and people became accustomed to that. And not only that, you see when you've got that kind of stagnation, you've got a real problem among young people because they're the last hired and first fired. And when you start your working life, whether you're being graduated from college, or at least you've got some college, or you're just getting the high school diploma, and you're going into the labor force, if you go into the labor force during a weak economy, it tends to have effects really throughout your life. As far as we know, it's a negative effect on your lifetime income. So I think it's not surprising that not only would you see this decline in support for markets, but that you would see this decline particularly concentrated among young people. And what this suggests to me is that as important as it is that we make the negative case against socialism, particularly for people who aren't really familiar with what socialism means in practice, because they're too young to have memories of the Cold War and of socialism as a viable seeming alternative in the West. we've also got to make the positive case for markets, and we've got to reform free market capitalism to make sure that it is continuing to work and deliver those benefits that we're accustomed to. And I think there's a lot of places where people have particular concerns where we haven't brought the advantages of markets to bear. And I do want to get to the conversation, so I'll just try to do this kind of quickly. But if you think about the sorts of problems that young people are having today, 3 areas: healthcare, housing, higher education. All of these are places where it's not so much that we've tried markets and that they failed, is that we haven't tried markets. In the case of housing, we've had, particularly in the fastest growing regions of the country, we've had a real problem of affordability that is caused overwhelmingly by localities who are not willing to allow supply to increase. And when you have high demand and restricted supply, you get higher prices. Higher education, you've got a cartel, basically. You've got a system that is powerfully shaped by federal policies, funneling enormous amounts of money while also regulating what can get that money. You've got a system that seemed to work for a long time, but has run into diminishing returns. And you've now got about 1 in 6 of young people who follow the path that the system is designed to work for, right? That get the high school diploma, then enroll in college, complete college, then get a job that requires a college degree. It's great for those people. It's not working for most young people. Again, this is a place where conservatives haven't really had much influence over policy, and we need to start focusing on that in a way that we haven't before. And then finally, healthcare, I think people are a little bit more familiar over because of the discussions we've had over the last 12 years over it, of all the ways in which, again, we've subsidized demand and restricted supply, and this has really eaten into wages and created problems for people, again, particularly for young people. So my takeaway from the socialism conversation is not so much that we just need to bash socialism, is that we need to revive free market capitalism. And there's an entire reform agenda that we as conservatives and libertarians need to be focusing on. The bad news is that there's something real that's going on here. The good news is I think conservatives do have potential solutions, and it's to those that we need to now turn. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ramesh. This is obviously an important and a timely topic, and we'll get to some questions, and there are some already in the chat box related to kind of how the current pandemic may shape some of this. But I want to keep it a little broader for the moment, and I'm glad that you brought up the idea of telling the positives about capitalism versus only harping on the many very real negatives about socialism. Do you think that there's been a complacency about those who espouse, free markets in their willingness to take that on? Do you think there's been a complacency from a policymaker standpoint in being sure to promote, these ideas through actual policy making? Where would you put most of the fault for that?
Well, I think that a big part of what happened is that market-oriented politicians and thinkers, maybe not complacency, but inertia. So there was a set of challenges that conservatives dealt with, and conservatives were really creative in addressing from the late 70s onward. So there's a problem of stagflation, to which we responded with monetary restraint and tax cuts. There's a problem with gas lines in the late 1970s, to which we responded by decontrolling oil prices, and pretty much overnight that problem disappeared. But over time, some new problems have emerged. Healthcare was a much smaller part of the economy in the early 1980s than it has subsequently become. It certainly wasn't about, between a sixth and a fifth of the economy the way it is now. And it was something that conservatives could sort of write off as a democratic issue. There was a story of some conservative activists going to George H.W. Bush when he was vice president, gearing up for his presidential run, telling him, we need to talk about childcare, we need to talk about healthcare, and he brushed them off, saying, these are democratic issues. It wasn't actually entirely wrong for him to brush them off in that campaign, but it's something that has become a bigger and bigger issue. Higher education, the strategy of funneling more and more people and money into brick and mortar four-year institutions made enormous sense in the early 1980s, but it just hit diminishing returns. And so I think it's hard, particularly for successful movements, to move on from their success to address new challenges. I think that's part of what happened.
Great. Now, I wonder how much too the idea of people that tend to support limited government and free markets tend to believe in federalism also. And as much as you might say some issues like healthcare, housing, or were in the past democratic issues, there were also issues of local governance to a large extent. And I think when you have a national conversation, there's kind of a natural inclination among those of us who subscribe to these beliefs to say, well, keep the federal government out of it.
Right.
And the opposite of that is, or the logical conclusion of that is, and then it is not to say then don't engage at the local level, but that nevertheless, that's kind of what happened in a lot of cases.
Yeah, well, and I think that instinct is a good one, right? It's a solid, constitutionally rooted one. But just to give you an example, this is maybe 10 years ago, I was talking to some Republican members of Congress, some conservative Republican members of Congress, about the higher education question and different things that ought to be done. And one of the responses I got from a couple of them was, well, there's nothing in the Constitution about higher education. Should we be involved in this at all? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable question, actually. But the point I made to them, look, I don't, I was maybe a little bit more polite about it than this, but it's like, look, I don't see you guys sponsoring legislation to get rid of Pell Grants and to get rid of Stafford loans. If we agree that we are not doing that anytime soon, can we make these issues, can we make them work in a way that is more respectful of markets and competition and federalism and accountability than what we've got now? Like one of the ideas I was talking about was, if you've got an institution which has a high rate of its graduates defaulting on their federal student loans, maybe those institutions should eat some of that, not just federal taxpayers. Maybe that's not the first best solution. Maybe we shouldn't have gone down this road in the first place of having this degree of federal involvement. But given that we have it, maybe there are things we ought to be doing. So I think that the sound instinct to not want the federal government involved can sometimes lead to a kind of paralysis in policymaking, which is really unfortunate. It's unfortunate both because it prevents us from offering solutions, but also because liberals never feel it, right? They always have policy proposals that involve more government spending, more government regulation. Let's forgive all student loans. Let's spend multiple trillions more dollars in this space. And if our answer is just going to be pointing out the drawbacks of those proposals, but not offering any solutions of our own, well, we can win a lot of those battles, but in the long run, you have to win every battle or you just lose ground. And so that's what I think you would see.
Well, and at the risk of sounding self-serving as the head of a state-based think tank, I do believe that a lot of those issues are ripe for the federal government following the state's lead and letting the states be those laboratories of democracy as they've been described. Welfare reform in the 1990s came out of successful state reforms. Healthcare in particular seems to be one where trying to come up with one policy that suits 330 million Americans all at the same time on such a personal issue, unless you want a federal solution, as our friends on the left might want, you kind of have to look at what the states are doing and then use that to inform, how the federal government acts within some parameters.
Yeah. What was, if you think about Obamacare and the net damage that it did to the healthcare system, in my view, we've been subsidizing healthcare for a very long time in a lot of ways, through the tax cut, through Medicare and Medicaid. What changed with Obamacare was that the federal government became the primary regulator of health insurance, displaced the states, and imposed a lot of regulatory costs on insurance that's led to all kinds of problems. That, it seems to me, is something in a way that we lost sight of when we were talking about getting rid of Obamacare, because it seems to me that the principal thing you want to do in order to move towards a more market-based healthcare system is to devolve power, regulatory power especially, to the states. So absolutely, our vision in a lot of areas needs to be one that thinks about how the states can play a greater role than the federal government.
And along with that, one area that I always encourage folks who agree with these principles to think about is thinking about the local level of government as well. I mean, you look at an issue like housing, and that is such a locally driven issue when it comes to policy. And unless the pandemic causes some dramatic flight from density, we're not going to see fewer people living in cities probably anytime soon. So it's an area, again, that the folks on the right have kind of abdicated and said, that's Democrats run cities. Well, the results haven't been so good, for one thing, and for another, that's where a lot of the people are. So we have to think on that level as well. We've got a bunch of great questions, so I want to start getting to some of those. Let's see. We've got one. Do you agree that part of the problem is that many who call themselves socialists are willing to verbally renounce the atrocities of Stalin and the governments of the states of the former communist bloc? And I know I read something that you wrote at one point about Bernie Sanders' description of democratic socialism and how he sort of, glossed right over all the negatives, and likewise glossed over the possibility that capitalism may have done some good for a lot of people over the years. But has that de-linkage between those atrocities specifically been a big problem with this?
Yeah, so progressivism has only one political tense, the future perfect. And so it can't describe or really grapple with the problems of actual socialist regimes in history except through evasion. And that's what Sanders does, right? I mean, he basically says, oh, no, I don't mean Venezuela. Well, nobody starts out meaning Venezuela. That's just what you get when you go down this road. All I'm really interested in is Denmark. Well, if you look at those Scandinavian countries, a lot of them have abandoned wealth taxes. A lot of them have more privatized pension systems than we do. They have less progressive tax codes than we do. There's no real interest in his part on actually learning from these other countries, right? He's just an ideologue through and through, and it does work, right? It does work on a lot of people, but it's not persuasive, precisely because it's so evasive. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why you ended up with actually having less public support than was hyped. There was something else. There was another finding from earlier this year during the primaries where they asked people Would you be willing to vote for a well-qualified presidential candidate if you were, African American, or if the candidate were a woman, and so forth? And the lowest number that you got was if they were a socialist. And something like 45% of people said that they'd be willing to give you a hearing in the first place, right? So, so there is a certain degree of I think common sense still left among people, where there's skepticism, and you saw that again on the campaign trail. People like, yeah, Medicare for all, that sounds great. Oh wait, no, you mean I can't buy health insurance anymore? The insurance I currently have is taken away and replaced by something that Bernie Sanders and Nancy Pelosi come up with. I'm not as sold on that idea.
Gonna kind of combine two here. One that says it seems that higher education today is leaning toward the democratic socialist agenda, despite the evidence against the success of the socialist part of that equation. How do we win the battle of thought in those formative years of our future leaders and contributors? And then along those lines, someone suggests that we should have a campaign of educating voters in a simple way, and along with the higher ed example, such as how socialism would have affected their grades if it had been in place when they went to college, that sort of thing. So, how do we reach those young, impressionable minds?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to split that into two questions, one having to deal with young people and one having to deal with colleges. We all, I think, sometimes mix those two things up and forget that only 1/3 of young people are going and getting those college degrees. So we've got a broader problem than just the college population. Starting with the colleges, though, I mean, no question that they've leaned left for a very long time, and now they're not just leaning, but almost sort of toppling over in that direction. And I think that one of the things we have to do, look, we have to fight the good fight on college campuses. We've got to nurture organizations of conservatives and libertarians and just free thinkers on college campuses. But I think we just also have to have institutional reform. We've got to sort of break the cartel. So, for example, if you think about accreditation standards for colleges, these are basically run to say you've got to be just like every other college in order to get access to federal money. And we need to break that up. And some senators like Mike Lee of Utah have been talking about doing that. And I think it's really important because those sorts of things are going to be used increasingly as weapons for ideological control. We've already seen attempts to take away some evangelical colleges' accreditation because they don't line up with where the left does on hot button social issues. So that's something that we need to change. We need to allow people to get certifications and not have to get college degrees in order to do a wide range of occupations and so forth. That's the college side of it. I know I'm not doing full justice to as big a challenge as it is, but I also want to say something about young people and their conservatism or lack thereof. Because if you look at the non-college portion of young people, they're not particularly conservative either. And a lot of the problems that you see in terms of questions of free speech or just questions of government control, you see it with the young non-college population as well. And I'll say that this just raises another huge question, I understand. But one of the reasons conservatives are not doing as well among young people as among older people, or as we should be doing, is that young people are browner and blacker than older people. I mean, just if you look at the demographics of it, a large part of what we think of as our problem with young voters is our problem with non-white voters. We've got to break out of the box that we're in terms of racial demographics. And if we do, we will start seeing ourselves do better among young people.
Sorry, got to unmute myself there.
We're all adjusting to this new world. I'm finding it's really odd for me dealing with an audience that's not drinking as I speak. Or maybe you guys are.
Well, don't make any assumptions.
Yeah.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere. So yeah, we could have a little 3 martini lunch going on behind the scenes here. But bringing it to a little bit more of the current events, it seems like the socialism that both Bernie and AOC promote is less communist, i.e. nationalizing the means of production, and more welfare statist. Are you concerned at all about the COVID-19 pandemic and response advancing specifically this plank of what most U.S. socialist leaders are promoting?
Well, there's no question that COVID has dramatically increased federal spending. And is going to continue to do that, and federal regulation, right? In terms of just the telling people, well, not just federal regulation, I should say state regulation and local regulation primarily, in terms of telling people they've got to be closed, they've got to stay in their homes, and so forth. I don't know that I think that actually most people are capable of distinguishing between emergency measures and palliative measures on the one hand, and sort of ongoing government commitments on the other. And we're also seeing some deregulation. We're seeing some regulations be lifted because they get in the way of a COVID response, like most prominently some of these restrictions on medical personnel and the sorts of things that they can do in the places that they can do it. I think that we're going to have to be on the lookout for all kinds of opportunistic attempts to leverage this crisis in order to have permanent expansions of government. So my answer to the question is yes, I am worried about it, but I don't think that we're without resources in fighting that back at all. I think that that we're going to be able to do that pretty successfully, and we've already seen, so Senate Majority Leader McConnell, I think, drew the right distinction. Not everybody has been able to follow what he's saying when he said, look, state relief is one thing, bailing out state mismanaged pensions is another, and Republicans are just not going to go along with that.
Right. Are there, and this gets to one of the other questions posted, and we're, again, if you want to send a question here, we have a few more minutes, so please put those in the chat box. Are there particular aspects maybe of the response that could be a little more insidious from that standpoint? And a person asks about the enhanced unemployment benefits and where that makes it more lucrative in some cases not to work than to work, and making it more difficult for small businesses to reopen once they're allowed to reopen, because they're competing with the government for their employees at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we think about things like universal basic income and some of those softer edged proposals that are out there, does that cause you some concern?
So the enhanced unemployment benefits are going to have to be scaled back as we return to normal. It's going to be particularly bad in the restaurant industry. If you think they're going to have to be dealing with lower density and lower volume in all likelihood, and they're already such a low margin industry with such a high rate of business failure year to year. We have scaled back unemployment benefits in the past. We did it at the tail end of the last recession. So this is something that can be done in the context of an improving labor market. I just think it just has to be. There's no way that we can sustain this level of benefits moving forward. I'm not as concerned about the universal basic income. This is a country that has a pretty strong belief in work. If you compare it to most other advanced countries, we work longer hours. We're more concerned about work. And I actually kind of liked Andrew Yang. I think he seems like a real person when you saw him on the stage. But the idea is not one, I think, that is actually going to take off in the United States, because people want work requirements. They don't want to just pay to let people sit around all day.
All right, and here's a good one, maybe for us to take as our last one as we approach the top of the hour here. But how can conservatives better articulate the moral case for the societal benefits of liberty and free markets?
That's a great question, and it's one that sort of we all kind of have to devote more thinking about. I think that I think that what's important is to explain to people, not even actually explaining is maybe the wrong way, to prod people to reflect on how we have built prosperity and how we deliver value in almost every area of American life. And you can get people to see that their iPhones are amazing and a product of market capitalism. But then but even people who see that will say, but yeah, but it's so hard, to afford a home, to start a family, to provide for healthcare. And I think what you've got to say is, well, maybe that's because the things that we have done to make iPhones so available to people are things we're not doing in these other areas that are important to people's lives. And maybe that's what we should start doing. And I think maybe you can sort of open people's eyes a little bit to this kind of bifurcated economy that we've got, and how the thing to do is not to throw everything that works away, but to build on what works and reform the things that don't.
Well, that's a great thought there. Anything else that you wanted to mention? One last suggestion that comes really more from the Q&A is a suggestion of reading the Conscious Capitalism Credo, which expresses the moral implication of capitalism incredibly well. I think that'll do it from our audience input, but any final thoughts that you want to give us as we wrap up here?
Well, I think that, one thing we didn't talk about, there's been a little bit of a decline in the right in support for markets as well. And I think maybe some of us need to reacquaint ourselves with things like Michael Novak's great writing on how capitalism sort of brings out the best and is a creative form of community. It's a way we can work together to achieve common aims and coordinate without centralized coercive direction. That's another important piece of, I think, the moral case for markets, and it's one that the people at Georgia Policy and National Review Institute are working on all the time. So I'll just close by thanking all of our participants and thanking you and my colleagues at NR and NRI for setting this up.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate your participation in finding a way to do it in spite of what's going on in the world. We have been recording this, and so we will be posting it online for viewing later, and I'm sure we can communicate that link to people. But I just want to thank you and your colleagues at NRI for all the work that you do to articulate these values so well. They're certainly inspiring for those of us who are working at the state level and trying to provide some proof points about how limited government actually works to people's benefits. In our case, in a state like Georgia, but there are organizations like ours, in all 50 states, and working to try to prove that this is the way that you can go about building a better economy and a better society for everyone. So I believe that will wrap it up for us. And unless one of our organizers here is going to cut me off and tell me that I've forgotten something, we just want to thank everyone for tuning in and encourage you to continue following the work of both of these great organizations. Thanks very much.